My name is Sarah Bryan, and today I'll be presenting the final briefing on the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act. I want to thank my whole team and our advisor, Professor McCadney, for all of their help and feedback throughout the semester. And before we start, I also just want to briefly acknowledge that we currently are located on the traditional homeland of the Lenape people, and that we want to honor and pay respect to all Indigenous people by recognizing their relationship with this land. So today we're going to talk about four things. First, we'll go over the current status of wildlife conservation in the United States. Then we'll talk about what the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act proposes, and then the program design and the implementation plan that our team have created. So first is the current status of wildlife conservation in the United States. And our team has identified three main issues to conservation that we want to focus on today, and those are habitat fragmentation, biodiversity loss, and inadequate tribal land management. So habitat fragmentation is the process through which large habitats are broken down into smaller pieces that are divided by uninhabitable land, and that decreases the ability of species to move to find resources such as food and water, to find appropriate mates, and to seasonally migrate, all of which decrease the ability of a species to survive, grow, and reproduce. This makes habitat loss and degradation the leading cause of global biodiversity loss, which is really important for human populations because we rely on these diverse species for ecosystem services, for our livelihoods, and because a lot of species hold special cultural importance to different indigenous groups. In the United States, indigenous tribes are also uniquely impacted by habitat fragmentation because they historically have been displaced onto scattered reservation land, and they've not received adequate federal funding to manage this land for conservation purposes. With over 56 million acres of Native American reservation land that's home to many species of conservation concern, this lack of federal funding is an environmental, social, and political concern. So one potential solution that addresses all three of these issues is creating tribal wildlife corridors. A wildlife corridor is an area of land that connects two habitat fragments together and allows species to safely move and migrate between habitats. By creating wildlife corridors on tribal land specifically, we can ensure that Native Americans are included in the nation's conservation priorities and that they're being funded appropriately. So one example of a place where we've seen the positive impact that a tribal wildlife corridor can have is with the Santa Ana Pueblo. This is a Native American tribe that lives on a 79,000 acre reservation in New Mexico, and their land had been really severely degraded through overhunting, overgrazing, and just general mismanagement that led to the loss of many native species as well as some culturally important species such as the pronghorn pictured here. The governor of the Santa Ana Pueblo described this as not only an environmental issue, but as a threat to their cultural integrity. So in response, they embarked on an ambitious plan to improve and restore their habitat. And this involved creating a Department of Natural Resources, conducting extensive scientific research and educational outreach, and adopting policies that specifically address the issues facing their community. And through all of these efforts, they were able to restore their habitat, successfully reintroduce the pronghorn, and their land now acts as part of a larger wildlife corridor that is along the migration pathway of many different species such as bear, deer, elk, and cougar. However, they've stated that there still is a lot more work to be done and that their work could really positively benefit from increased federal funding. And this story acts as an example of the impact that conservation projects on Native American land can have, as well as the need for increased funding to support these efforts. So to address this need, the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act was proposed in Congress, and we want to look at what exactly this bill sets out to do. So the policy objective of the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act is to increase habitat connectivity through the creation of tribal wildlife corridors by increasing federal funding and technical assistance directed towards Native American tribes. This has had a lot of support from different Native American groups, such as the Santa Ana Pueblo, but the bill is currently stalled in Congress, and past attempts to enact similar legislation have failed. So the bill mandates two specific processes. The first is the Tribal Wildlife Corridor designation process. So tribes can submit their land to be designated as a tribal wildlife corridor, which provides tribes with access to technical assistance from the Department of the Interior and requires that the DOI must consult with them on how to best improve and expand their corridors. So when a tribe nominates a corridor to be designated as a tribal wildlife corridor, the DOI will use a set of criteria that will be developed within 18 months of the bill's passage, but must at a minimum be based on whether or not the corridor can restore, manage, and protect habitat to facilitate connectivity. The second program that the bill mandates is the grant program, and the bill doesn't outline any defined criteria for how these grants are going to be allocated, but it just states that one grant must be allocated within the first 3 years to help manage and expand wildlife corridors. Finally, the bill mandates that up to $50 million can be authorized annually to enact these two programs. So because there's so much discretion left up to the DOI about how to allocate grant funding, our team has decided to create a grant program design to figure out how best to allocate that funding. So the grant program design that we have created prioritizes habitat quality. This means that grants will be allocated based on the ecological benefit that each potential corridor could provide, and we'll be targeting those areas with the greatest habitat fragmentation that can impact the greatest number of species, with a particular emphasis on species of cultural importance to different Native American groups. This strategy allows the DOI to use science-backed data to ensure to understand which corridors have the greatest potential for ecological benefits, and will ensure that grant funding is allocated appropriately. So what exactly does this plan look like in implementation? Our team has developed a year 1 implementation plan for the year after the bill is passed, where months 1 through 6 really focus on recruiting and training program staff. This includes a program director, who will be an existing employee within the Department of the Interior, who will oversee program development and implementation. We'll also be hiring a program manager who will manage administrative tasks and the corridor designation process, and a grant manager to manage the grant program. We also will be creating a technical advisory group, which is a group of leaders from NGOs, academia, and other scientific organizations who are experts in areas such as landscape ecology, wildlife biology, and indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And they will be providing their expertise to help us develop the criteria that will be used to designate corridors as tribal wildlife corridors and to allocate the grant funding. Months 7 through 9 of year 1 will focus on creating a longer-term work plan for the first 3 years of the bill, conducting outreach to the Bureau of Indian Affairs regional offices to establish relationships with the staff there, and developing outreach materials such as a program website to inform tribes of this program and how they can best benefit from it. Months 10 through 12 will focus on developing that criteria for the designation process and for the grant program, and this will involve a lot of different tribal outreach efforts, such as creating a request for information and hiring a team of external contractors to talk directly with tribes to get their feedback on the program. So what this looks like for our year 1 budget, the majority of the funding will be going towards staffing and for that hiring the team of external contractors to do that tribal outreach. And there will also be some funding for travel to the regional BIA offices, funding for the technical advisory group to have a meeting, as well as general and administrative costs associated with hiring or other such things. And this will come out to about $537,000. We also think it's important to look at future years of the program. So in year 2, the emphasis will really be on getting corridors designated as tribal wildlife corridors and continuing to develop the criteria for the grant program. While in year 3 and beyond, we'll start using the full $50 million authorized each year, and the emphasis will be on getting the grant funding out the door, getting tribes access to technical assistance, and making sure that they can actually fulfill the policy objective of the Act. So the key takeaways today are that this bill addresses the issues of habitat fragmentation, biodiversity loss, and inadequate tribal land management by filling the conservation funding gap on Native American tribal land to create tribal wildlife corridors. The program design that we have created to fulfill this policy objective prioritizes those corridors with the greatest potential ecological benefits. And within the first year, we're going to be focusing on hiring staff, conducting tribal outreach, and beginning to develop the criteria for these 2 programs. So thank you all for listening. Any questions?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I was just wondering, your team has decided to develop the grant program over quite a number of years, which I think is quite different from many of the other teams. So I was just wondering, why have you guys chosen to do that, and what explicit benefit is there in taking so much time?
Yeah, so the bill kind of mandates that timeline. So it's 18 months where they have to create the criteria for corridor designation, and then it says that a grant just has to be given out within the first 3 years. So that's kind of the timeline that we were working on. And the bill is also really specific about wanting to include a lot of tribal consultation, and so we want to make sure that we're developing this grant program with adequate time to consult with tribes, get their feedback, and make sure that the program is actually going to benefit them and be more of a bottom-up approach rather than top-down. So we decided to kind of expand the timeline a little bit more to make sure we could do that.
Thank you for your presentation, Sarah. You talked about combining two different types of metrics for the grants, like having a science-based approach as well as looking at species that are more important to Native people. I was wondering if you think that the science-based approach could ever be at odds with Indigenous knowledge systems and how the grant would, how this would respond to that.
Yeah, we definitely have considered that possibility. The way that we kind of came to this quality-based program design is because we wanted to be able to use quantitative measures and like science-backed measurements of in order to understand what the greatest potential ecological benefit is going to be. And so we want to kind of like harder quantitative measures that we could use. The culturally important species are more of a qualitative measure that I think will be kind of taken as a secondary consideration in the grant application process, and tribes will have to explain in their applications why this is so important to them and what it means for their cultural integrity. So I think it's more of like a secondary part to it. But that's also something that will be a part of the tribal consultation that happens in those first 3 years is what is important to tribes to include in this application and how can we best kind of manage those two conflicting thoughts, yeah.
Thanks for a fantastic presentation, Sarah. I had a question about the designation of the corridors. What goes into that and what about a piece of land makes it able to be designated as a corridor?
Yeah, so the criteria for that is also pretty limited in the bill. And so they'll develop that at the beginning of the program. What the bill lays out is that a corridor has to have the possibility to restore and manage land to facilitate connectivity, and that you'll be prohibiting the creation of any barriers to that. That's kind of all that lays out, and so they'll have to continue to develop that throughout the beginning of the program to really understand.
Thank you.